Our first speaker tonight is Mackenzie Lobby Havey. She's a lot more active than me in life. She's the author of Mindful Running, recently published by Bloomsbury, USA, and she has been published in a number of leading publications, including TheAtlantic.com, ESPN, Runner's World, Self, and Outside. Mackenzie holds a graduate degree in sports psychology from the University of Minnesota, and she in the kinesio. I can't read. And has completed 14 marathons in the Ironman triathlon. Mackenzie lives in Minneapolis with her husband, 18-month-old daughter, and some kind of dog that starts with a V. Everybody give a warm welcome to your first presenter of the night, Mackenzie Lobby Havey, everybody.
Good evening. Thanks so much for having me tonight. So I want you to think about what comes to your mind when you think of meditation. What are those images that come to your head? Well, at one point in my life, this guy up here meditating on the mountainside in a loincloth pretty much summed up my ideas about meditation. I assumed it was this kind of esoteric spiritual exercise that involved new agey music and maybe some chanting. And so you may be wondering how someone like me, who is pretty skeptical and held these pretty misinformed stereotypes, ended up becoming a devoted meditator. And in my case, it all started with running. So I want to start with a quick story about the 2014 New York City Marathon. And this race is held every November, and so it can definitely serve up some pretty unexpected weather. But the 2014 event will really go down in history as one of the worst years in terms of conditions. This Arctic blast of air had swept across the country that week and arrived in New York City just in time for race morning. And these frigid 45-mile-an-hour winds were requiring race organizers to dismantle signage along the course. And the news crews along the course were having trouble keeping their video feeds up and running. And once the runners got going, these crazy crosswinds were nearly picking them up off their feet and blowing them sideways. And it was basically just a categorically brutal day for everyone involved there. And all the while, race director Mary Wittenberg stood at the finish line, as she did every year for many years, and that's where she would wait and greet the finishers. And as a journalist, I oftentimes get to interview people like Wittenberg, and I was talking to her about the event, and she brought up this 2014 race because she felt like it revealed something particularly striking that she hadn't seen before in all her years standing there at that finish line. And she said that she felt like the horrible weather conditions really put the runners in two distinct camps. So as they crossed the finish line, there was the camp of runners who appeared really tense and displeased with the entire experience and maybe muttering under their breath, and they looked really upset. And then there was the other camp of runners who appeared, windburned and cold, but kind of unfazed and actually pretty relaxed. And she wondered aloud to me, how could there be two totally different experiences in the face of the exact same conditions? And she surmised that that first group really ended up getting so wrapped up in worries about how that weather was going to affect their end goal in their finishing time that they really tensed up and fought that wind all 26 miles. Whereas the other group, she felt like kind of relaxed into the elements a little bit, just took it one step at a time and just tried to enjoy the day out there. And that meant that they were kind of less punished by that wind, and they had a better overall experience. And I really like this story because I've been a runner for a long time, and I kind of recognize myself in both groups at different points in my running career. So early on, I ran just because purely for the love of the sport. And it was just I loved the process of training and the process of going out for a run. But as I got older and I began running more marathons and I got more concerned about running personal bests or qualifying for races, I kind of put my blinders on and ended up kind of getting lost in the hustle for achievement. And the result really was that I kind of tensed up. And this introduced a lot of stress and anxiety surrounding running and more injuries and eventually burnout and just really a loss of joy overall. And I think a lot of us do this in different areas of life where we end up so focused on some end result that we don't take life just moment by moment. And it causes us to really tighten up and kind of fight the winds of life. So I began to wonder, how might I reframe my approach to running? And that's where mindfulness came in. So mindfulness is just defined as it's all about just upholding a present moment awareness in a non-judgmental manner. And so it's about really paying attention to what's directly in front of you. And so when I brought this spirit of present moment awareness to my running, I found an almost immediate easement of my stress and a return of the joy I felt early in my running career. And what's more, I was running a lot healthier. I wasn't getting injured. And I was running better, too. And so I began to think that this was kind of a revelation, because I think a lot of us understand that mindfulness and meditation might benefit us, but we're wary of traditional seated meditation, or we just feel like we don't have time for another thing in our schedule. So this felt like maybe you could get some of the benefits of mindfulness through activities you're already doing. So I started getting curious about this, and I began to interview other runners and Olympians and coaches and neuroscientists who study meditation, and this all became the inspiration behind my book, Mindful Running. And I learned a lot along the way. For instance, did you know that research out of Harvard suggests that our minds wander upwards of 50% of our waking hours? And on top of that, they tend to harbor a natural negativity bias when they're left to their own devices. So when you hear the reference to the monkey mind swinging from treetop to treetop, that's what they're talking about. And when they put people in MRI scanners and just say, just let your mind wander, they find that an area of the brain called the default mode network lights up. And while all mind wandering is not bad, and the default mode network serves important functions, it's also associated with anxious and self-referential thinking. So it's not a place you want to get stuck for too long. And conversely, when they put people in the scanner and ask them to meditate, that default mode network goes offline. So in addition to that, there's related research that really shows that meditation has been linked to reducing the biomarkers of stress, to reducing our perception of pain and discomfort, and to helping us more adeptly cope with anxiety. And so how can you begin applying the principles of mindfulness to things you're already doing? In my case, I implement these simple scanning exercises when I run. So first, I do an environmental scan. So I engage my 5 senses and try to really drop into my surroundings. Next, I do a head-to-toe body scan to figure out how I'm feeling physically that day. Do I push or do I back off? And finally, I do a mental scan to kind of see where my mental and emotional weather is at that day. And I think that while my anecdotes are about running, you can really apply these things to other things you're doing. So since writing my book, people have told me they use these techniques for everything from gardening to hiking to cycling. And all it takes are these simple scanning exercises that I mentioned, and then choosing an anchor to the present moment, which is usually for me my breath or my foot strike, and just trying to pay attention to that thing. And I think the idea is that you don't need to be that guy sitting in lotus position on the mountainside to gain some of the benefits of mindfulness. And best of all, the science of neuroplasticity suggests that when we apply mindfulness to one activity, whether it's seated meditation or running or something else, that it has the potential to change our brains in a really long-lasting fashion. So it's basically like bicep curls for the brain. So every time your mind wanders and you notice and bring it back to the present moment, that's like a rep in the gym. Those neural pathways are strengthened, and you become more mindful in all areas of your life. And that's certainly been my experience. I think mindful running has helped me become a more mindful parent and a more focused writer. And when those, winds of life do pick up, and I notice myself tensing in response, and that news ticker of worries in my mind about the future taking me out of the moment, I'm better at realizing that's happening now. And I realize that I just need to remind myself to pause, be where my feet are, and run the mile I'm in. Thank you.